When the maid's son catches the millionaire humiliating his mother, a simple video exposes the truth, brings down an empire, and transforms a family's pain into a movement capable of changing thousands of lives. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel now to receive impactful stories that touch your heart every day. The title echoes in the opening lines. Maid's son caught millionaire mistreating his mother. The scene opens in the luxurious mansion of Richard Coleman, a real estate mogul known for his explosive temper and arrogance. The morning sun streamed through the immense windows, reflecting on the light marble of the main entrance, as Mariah Johnson, the dedicated 40-year-old maid, tried to finish her work in silence. Suddenly, the tranquility was shattered. Richard's voice echoed through the house like thunder. "You never do anything right, Mariah. You're not even good enough to clean what I tell you to." He approached her with firm steps and a cold gaze, while the surrounding staff lowered their eyes, unable to intervene. What Richard didn't know was that, at that very moment, Ethan Johnson, Mariah's 15-year-old teenage son, had arrived home early from school and was watching from the half-open hallway door. His heart was pounding, his breath was shallow, and his hands were shaking as he held his cell phone. One click was all it took to capture what no one had ever dared to confront. And in that instant, Ethan's finger touched the screen, capturing every word, every look of contempt Richard cast at his mother. Ethan's cell phone vibrated in his sweaty hands, but he didn't look away. The camera captured every detail: Richard Coleman's rigid, weathered features, his haughty posture of a man accustomed to command, the tone of his voice filled with contempt that echoed against Mariah. Her head bowed. She tried to hold back tears, her fingers clasped together in front of the blue apron she wore, as if that were enough to contain the pain. "You should kneel and thank me every day for letting you work here," he roared, pacing the room like a king on his throne. "Without me, wouldn't you and that boy starve?" With each word, the silence of the other employees grew heavier. They all pretended to be busy, cleaning, sorting papers, adjusting small details, but deep down they knew they were witnessing yet another scene of humiliation. Ethan's heart burned with rage, yet his mind remained cold. It took courage to face this man, and now there was no turning back. Ethan took 2 firm steps down the hallway, emerging from the shadows that hid him. The sound of his sneakers against the marble floor made Richard stop abruptly and turn in surprise. The raised cell phone in the boy's hand reflected the light from the crystal chandelier, and in that instant, the tension in the room doubled. Richard's eyes narrowed. "What are you doing here, kid?" he snapped, his voice low but filled with suppressed fury. Ethan didn't respond. He moved closer, raising the phone to his face so it was clear he was recording everything. The air felt thin. Mariah looked up, her expression desperate, as if begging her son to back off. But Ethan didn't back away. Instead, he took another step forward, chin up, breathing deeply, his chest full of indignation. He knew he was staring at an abyss, but it was an abyss he could no longer ignore. Richard laughed, a dry laugh, almost a growl, and shook his head as if faced with an unforgivable insult. "You think you're going to intimidate me with that little toy?" he said, pointing to his cell phone as he took slow, heavy steps toward the boy. The sound echoed through the silent room, like hammer blows. The staff averted their eyes, unable to bear the scene. Mariah, desperate, tried to move to intercede, but Richard raised his hand in a sudden gesture that stopped her instantly. Ethan was breathing quickly, but his voice was firm, cutting through the air like a blade. "Enough. Don't talk to my mother like that." The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Richard's face hardened, his eyes flashed with anger, and in that instant, Everyone knew something was about to happen that would change the lives of everyone in that mansion forever. The silence that followed Ethan's words felt like a suppressed thunderclap. Richard Coleman stared at the 15-year-old boy, as if he couldn't believe what he'd heard. No one had ever dared confront him inside that house, least of all the housekeeper's son. His breathing quickened, his jaw clenched, and his blue eyes flashed with a fury that frightened even the oldest employees. "Who do you think you are, raising your voice at me, boy?" he spat, stepping closer. Ethan held his cell phone steady, his fingers clenched tightly around the device, his heart racing, but his courage stronger than his fear. Mariah, in tears, begged, "Please, Ethan, don't do this. Don't provoke." But her son didn't look away, nor did he retreat a step. The room, so vast and luxurious, seemed to shrink before the imminent confrontation. Richard raised his hand, not to hit, but to snatch the boy's cell phone. His gold ring gleamed in the light, and the expression on his face revealed the utter contempt of someone who never admitted to being contradicted. Ethan instinctively took a step back, but kept his arm raised, shielding the device with all his might. "You're not deleting anything," he said in a trembling but firm voice, each syllable laden with a determination that seemed not to come from a teenager, but from someone far beyond his years. Richard huffed in anger, and his voice thundered, "This is my world, boy. I decide what stays and what goes." The tension grew as if the entire mansion held its breath. Mariah, already desperate, threw herself between them, trying to prevent the collision. But Richard, merciless, pushed her aside without a second thought, as if she were merely an obstacle. The shove made Mariah lose her balance and fall against the coffee table, knocking over a stack of documents and a glass vase, which shattered on the floor. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Ethan rushed to help her, but Richard advanced even further, his face red, his breathing heavy. "You'll regret it, you insolent brat," he roared. In that moment, Ethan no longer thought about fear, or even about himself. His phone continued recording, capturing not only the words, but also the violence he had just witnessed. He helped his mother to her feet, his eyes brimming with tears, but when he looked back at Richard, there was something different in his gaze. He wasn't just an indignant son, he was a young man ready to take on an empire. And Richard, consumed by fury, didn't realize that every recorded second would become the weapon that would change his life forever. Ethan's hand still trembled as he held the phone, but the recording remained intact, every insult and every gesture of contempt captured in high definition. Richard, panting, tried to regain control of the situation, straightening his jacket and casting withering glances at everyone present. "This isn't going anywhere," he said in a lowered voice, but full of venom. Mariah, tears streaming down her face, held her son's arm, whispering, begging him to stop further challenging this man who could destroy their lives with a simple snap of his fingers. But Ethan, just 15 years old, had already made up his mind. He wouldn't erase anything. He put the phone in his pocket, protecting it like a shield, and even in the face of Richard's imposing presence, he didn't look away. The millionaire smiled menacingly, a smile that blended hatred with the absolute confidence of someone who believed himself above all law. Hours later, as night fell over the city, Ethan locked himself in his small room, his heart still racing from what had happened. The sound of his mother falling against the table and the sound of the vase breaking echoed in his mind like an unforgettable nightmare. He stared at his phone screen repeatedly, replaying the video. Each time the scene repeated, indignation grew within him. He thought about what would happen if he remained silent. He thought about what Richard would do tomorrow, next week, next month, if no one stopped him. It was as if that recording had been placed in his hands as a mission greater than himself. Without telling his mother, Ethan opened the social media app, typed a simple title, "The Truth About Richard Coleman," and hit send. The next morning, as Richard sipped coffee on the mansion's porch, still confident he'd intimidated mother and son, the digital world was already buzzing. The video had spread like wildfire. Within hours, hundreds of comments had piled up, people outraged by the cruel words, others shocked by the shove that nearly seriously injured Mariah, and many demanding immediate justice. Some former employees, upon seeing the footage, began commenting anonymously that it wasn't the first time Richard had treated employees that way. His name quickly rose to the top of the trending topics, and news outlets were already publishing the headline. Tycoon Richard Coleman accused of verbally abusing Maid in viral video. In his small bedroom, Ethan watched his phone vibrate non-stop with notifications, knowing there was no going back from the decision he'd made that night. Richard Coleman read the headlines on his tablet, his fingers tapping nervously against the glass table on the balcony. With each scroll, his face grew redder, the veins in his neck bulged, and his blue eyes narrowed like razors. The video had already racked up over 500,000 views in less than 12 hours. Outraged comments, calls for an investigation, and hashtags calling for a boycott of his real estate empire flooded social media. The pride that had always sustained his image as an unbeatable man was now being struck directly by a 15-year-old boy and the woman he despised. "This is a farce," he roared, hurling the tablet against the wall, the shattered sound echoing through the room. The house staff looked at each other in silence, fearing they would become the next target of their boss's fury. But Richard no longer cared about appearances at that moment. There was no filter, just the pure rage of someone feeling his authority crumble. While he roared with rage inside the mansion, reporters were already crowding the gates outside, microphones in hand, cameras rolling, trying to capture any reaction. The luxury cars parked at the entrance became the scene of a media storm, and the name Richard Coleman was splashed across primetime television screens. The boards of his companies called non-stop, demanding explanations, fearing a stock plunge and investors fleeing. Richard paced the main room, his heavy footsteps marking the rhythm of his rage, as he barked incoherent orders. "Call my lawyers, shut down these gates, lock these people out." His tone was no longer that of a calculating tycoon, but of a man cornered. And with each ignored phone call, each resignation message from business partners, the weight of reality became impossible to deny. In the kitchen, Mariah and Ethan heard the screams echo, the sharp words piercing through walls and doors. The boy stared at his mother, feeling the mixture of fear and pride in her eyes. She clutched his arm, as if protecting him from something that could no longer be avoided. "Ethan, you don't understand. He's going to destroy our lives," she whispered, her voice trembling. But Ethan, still holding his cell phone, replied firmly, "No, Mom. He can't silence us anymore. Now everyone knows who he really is." Outside, cameras flashed like lightning, and inside the mansion, Richard's roar grew louder, announcing that the battle was just beginning. That night, when silence finally fell over the mansion, Mariah sat on the edge of Ethan's narrow bed, her hands clasped together, her eyes still red from crying. The room was simple, contrasting with the over-the-top luxury of Richard's house. But it was there that mother and son found what little peace they had left. "Ethan," she began, her voice soft, almost pleading, "you need to delete that video. You don't know what this man is capable of." The boy, lying with his cell phone clutched in his hands, looked up at his mother, and the firmness in his 15-year-old eyes didn't seem like that of a teenager. but rather of someone who had already carried more pain than he should. If I delete it, he'll stay, Mom. He'll stay with you, with me, with anyone who can't defend themselves. The words were filled with conviction, but also with a weight the young man shouldn't carry alone. Mariah sighed, pressing his hand to her chest, somewhere between hope and fear. She tried to reason with him, reminding him of everything they'd suffered. Son, we have nothing. Do you think anyone will protect us if this man decides to take revenge? He has money. He has influence. He can destroy our lives with a simple phone call. Her voice trembled, and tears streamed down her face, scarred by the exhaustion of years of hard work. Ethan listened, but inside him something burned stronger than fear. The memory of seeing his own mother pushed to the ground as if she were invisible. He couldn't erase it from his mind, couldn't accept that silence was the only option. Maybe we don't have money, Mom. Maybe we don't have power, but we have the truth. And sometimes, that's bigger than anything. His gaze locked with her mother's eyes made Mariah shiver, because for the first time she realized her son was willing to face the whole world for her. As the argument unfolded between the two, the world outside continued to turn, but now with its eyes on the Johnson family. The video had already crossed borders, being replicated in different languages, shared by celebrities denouncing the abuse of power and by workers' rights organizations. With each new viewing, the noose around Richard Coleman tightened. Mariah, heartbroken, felt pride in her son, but also a growing fear that this act of courage might cost her dearly. She stood, wiping away tears with the back of her hand, and looked at Ethan, who was still clutching his phone tightly. "Just promise me you'll be careful," she said, her voice breaking. Ethan nodded silently, but deep down he knew there was no turning back. The truth was out, and nothing in the world could stop it. The next morning, the iron gates of the Coleman mansion were surrounded by a throng of journalists. Cameras blared, microphones extended, reporters from various TV networks jostled for space to capture any reaction. Luxury cars tried to enter and exit under security guards, but the din of shouted questions about the scandal drowned out any orders given by the staff. "Richard, is the video real? Do you usually treat your employees this way? Did you push Mrs. Johnson?" The questions hammered like bullets, and with each silence in the mansion, more headlines splashed across the screens. Meanwhile, inside the house, Richard paced in circles, breathing heavily, trying to call his most influential contacts. But many didn't answer, and the few who did responded coldly, as if they no longer wanted to be involved in his imminent downfall. In the early hours of the morning, his firm's New York and Chicago offices were in an uproar. Investors were calling, demanding urgent explanations, worried about the impact on the company's reputation and the falling stock. Reports showed that the video had already caused a drop in value in just 2 days, and that clients were canceling high-value contracts because they didn't want to associate their names with a man publicly accused of abuse. In an emergency video conference meeting, directors stared at Richard with cold, distant eyes. One of them said bluntly, "We need you to speak up immediately, or we'll be facing an irreversible crisis." Richard, his face hardened, responded in short sentences, trying to control the narrative, but everyone could see he was no longer in control. Meanwhile, Ethan watched everything unfold through his cell phone screens. The teenager saw newspapers broadcasting excerpts of the recording on national television, politicians commenting on the case as an example of inequality and abuse of power, and celebrities expressing support for his mother. Mariah, silent, ran her hand through her hair, distressed by the scale of the situation. She knew the battle was just beginning, but now there was no retreat. Inside the mansion, Richard began to lose the control he had always believed was absolute. With each ignored call, each closed door, the reality became clear. The empire he had built with such pride was crumbling not at the hands of competitors, but because of a simple cell phone in the hands of a boy who refused to accept silence. Cornered by media pressure and fear of financial ruin, Richard Coleman decided he needed to act quickly to regain control of the narrative. He gathered his most expensive lawyers and image consultants in the mansion's main room, the same place where he had humiliated Mariah days earlier. His tone was harsh, but betrayed a hint of desperation. "This won't destroy me," he said, running a hand through his graying hair as he faced his team. One lawyer suggested suing Mariah for defamation, claiming it was all a scheme to extort money from him. Another recommended hiring influencers to create a counter-story, painting Richard as the victim of a conspiracy. Richard nodded, absorbing each idea, but deep down he feared something no lawyer could erase. The truth was already out in the open, and the public's eyes would never be closed again. That same afternoon, an official statement was sent to the press. In it, Richard claimed the video had been manipulated and edited in a biased manner by a resentful employee and a rebellious teenager seeking attention. "I regret that my generosity in employing certain people has been repaid with ingratitude and lies," the statement read, attempting to reverse the roles. But the strategy felt artificial. While lawyers sent legal threats and demanded the video's removal from social media, internet users reacted en masse. Comments mocked the statement, calling Richard an oppressive boss and emphasizing that the footage showed no cuts or manipulations, only naked cruelty. The more he denied this, the more outrage grew. Ethan watched the impromptu press conference on television in the maid's room, next to his mother. He saw Richard standing before the cameras, well-dressed, his hair carefully combed, but his eyes nervous, trying to look steady as he recited memorized lines. Mariah, arms crossed, murmured softly, "He'll never admit it." Ethan's heart pounded. He knew Richard's lie might convince some for a moment, but he also knew there was something no one could refute. The truth remained stored on his phone, ready to be revealed in its entirety. And in that moment, the flame of decision began to ignite within him. If Richard was trying to manipulate the world, perhaps it was time to face the cameras and expose everything once and for all. Among all the professionals Richard Coleman had summoned to manage the crisis, one voice stood out. Claire Mitchell, the company's communications director, was present at the meeting, but her steady gaze and serious demeanor didn't hide her discomfort. While the lawyers talked about manipulation, lawsuits, and fake campaigns, she remained silent, watching her boss lose his balance in front of everyone. For years, Claire had built her career on ethics, and even working for a man like Richard, she believed the truth always found a way. When he finished issuing new orders, she calmly stood up and said, "Mr. Coleman, with all due respect, no press release can erase what we saw in that video. Lies won't save you this time." The room fell into a heavy silence. Richard turned his head slowly, his eyes filled with fury, as if he couldn't believe anyone on his team would dare challenge him publicly. "Are you saying I should admit to a fraud?" he retorted, slamming his hand on the oak table, the sound echoing like thunder. Claire, undeterred, kept her tone firm. "I'm not saying you should admit something that didn't happen. I'm saying it did. The video is clear. I was there on several occasions, and I've witnessed how you treat your employees. You can try to cover it up, but sooner or later it will all come to light. And when it does, the fallout will be even worse." Her words pierced the room like knives, and some lawyers lowered their eyes uncomfortably. Richard, red with anger, tried to interrupt her, but Claire continued, "I will not lend my voice to cover up abuse. If you want to continue down this path, do it without me. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the distant sound of reporters at the gates. That night, as Richard prepared more strategies to defend himself, Claire made a decision. Alone in her Dallas apartment, she opened an old folder on her computer. There were records from years of working for Richard, emails, voicemails, and even brief notes from meetings where she had witnessed attacks on employees and veiled threats against anyone who dared to cross him. With a simple click, she could change the course of everything. The dilemma was immense. Risk her career and confront one of the most powerful men in the industry, or remain silent and be complicit in yet another lie. As she stared at the illuminated screen, a single phrase echoed in her mind, the same one she had said hours earlier: "Lying won't save you this time." And so, with a deep sigh, Claire began organizing the files, knowing that her action could be the key to turning the tide once and for all. The next few hours were a whirlwind for Mariah and Ethan. The video had already been shared nationwide, but until that moment they remained anonymous shadows, referred to only as the Maid and the teenage son. However, faced with Richard's attempts to distort the facts, Claire Mitchell discreetly contacted him. She met Mariah in a simple cafe, away from the flashes and cameras, and spoke candidly. "He'll keep saying it's all a setup unless you show the world who you really are. This decision isn't easy, but it can change everything." Mariah held her cup with trembling hands, her gaze lost, while Ethan firmly replied, "Then let's talk. I'm not afraid." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of the spoon hitting the rim of the cup, as if marking the beginning of a new phase. The next day, a small local Oklahoma station was the first to open its doors. Mariah arrived accompanied by her son, simple as ever, wearing a light blouse and modest pants, her hair tied up in a practical way. Ethan, wearing a dress shirt borrowed from a neighbor, stood erect, his gaze serious but full of determination. When the cameras began rolling, the host asked, "Are you the woman in the video?" Mariah took a deep breath, her eyes welling with tears, and replied, "Yes, I'm Mariah Johnson. I worked for years in that house, endured humiliation in silence, but I never imagined my son would witness this." Her choked voice touched the hearts of those watching. Then Ethan took the microphone and added, "I recorded it because I couldn't take it anymore. I don't want money. I don't want fame. I just want respect for my mother and justice." The words echoed like a real scream. The impact was immediate. Social media exploded with messages of support. Hashtags expressing solidarity with Mariah and Ethan went viral, and human rights organizations offered legal and psychological support to the family. Celebrities shared excerpts from the interview, calling the boy a hero and Mariah a symbol of quiet courage. On the other side, Richard Coleman watched the broadcast from his living room, his fists clenched and his eyes filled with hatred. He knew that this appearance changed everything. These were no longer just anonymous images that could be dismissed. These were real faces, voices, and tears exposing his cruelty. The empire built on arrogance was beginning to crumble in the face of what he feared most, the unvarnished truth, spoken by those who had nothing to lose. Richard Coleman sat in his conference room, surrounded by glass walls that reflected not power but fragility. His company directors avoided his gaze, exchanging discreet messages while the millionaire tapped his fingers nervously on the table. "It's a phase, it will soon pass," he repeated aloud, as if trying to convince himself. But reality crushed him. Major investors withdrew capital, million-dollar contracts were canceled overnight, and even longtime partners publicly declared they would not tolerate abuse against workers. The company's shares plummeted, and his image as an invincible man now appeared in newspaper caricatures, portrayed as a tyrant in decline. The pride that sustained him turned to despair, and with each notification on his cell phone announcing more losses, Richard realized he was surrounded by a deafening silence. No one wanted to defend him anymore. Outside, the press fueled the collapse like wildfire. TV shows replayed the video relentlessly, highlighting Mariah and Ethan's interview, which had moved millions. Headlines carried harsh phrases, "The end of the Coleman Empire, when arrogance meets truth." In the company's corridors, employees who had previously walked in silence now felt free to speak out, telling stories of humiliations that had accumulated over the years. Each account made Richard's image even more indefensible. Even former political allies began to distance themselves, fearing the taint of their own image. The man who for decades had been synonymous with absolute power was now seen as an example of what money could not conceal forever. At the mansion, Richard isolated himself in his office, drinking whiskey after whiskey, trying to find a way out. His mind teemed with hatred, and yet an emptiness began to gnaw at him. He stared in the mirror and barely recognized his own reflection, swollen eyes, disheveled hair, the hunched posture of someone who had lost control. All this because of a brat and a maid, he muttered, unaware that those words only reinforced his downfall. As he spoke to himself, new notifications popped up on his phone, more canceled contracts, more repudiation notices. The empire he had built with an iron fist, sustained by intimidation and fear, was now crumbling in public, brick by brick, with nothing he could do to stop it. As Richard sank into despair and isolation, Mariah and Ethan began to see an unexpected movement blossom around them. The interview broadcast on local television had spread like wildfire, reaching not only the city but the entire country. People from different states sent messages of support, some offering financial help, others simply words of encouragement. In their humble neighborhood, neighbors who had previously barely exchanged greetings began reaching out, bringing Mariah food, clothing, and even job offers. In front of their small rented house, flowers began to be left with anonymous notes that read, "Thank you for your courage, and you represent us." Ethan, still overwhelmed by everything, felt the weight of responsibility, but also a deep pride in seeing his mother, once invisible, now treated as a symbol of dignity. Labor rights organizations reached out to Mariah, offering free legal support and assuring her that she wouldn't face Richard alone in court. Ethan, invited by a local public school, gave a brief speech to other teenagers, explaining what had motivated him to record the video. His words, simple but filled with truth, drew applause and tears from both students and teachers. "I just wanted my mother to be respected. It wasn't too much to ask," he said, and the phrase was repeated in newspapers and on social media as if it were a mantra of resistance. For Mariah, it was both frightening and comforting. She had never imagined herself in the spotlight, but seeing that her pain was serving to awaken so many people brought her a comfort she had never known before. For the first time, she felt she wasn't alone. Community support grew so much that a vigil was organized outside Richard's company building, with candles, signs, and slogans against labor abuses. Hundreds of people attended, some of them former employees who, encouraged by Mariah and Ethan, finally found the courage to tell their own stories. The scene, broadcast live on independent channels, went viral within minutes. Workers united, illuminating the night with small flames that symbolized the fight for dignity. Mariah, watching alongside her son, wept silently, feeling that the truth she had so often tried to hide was now transformed into collective strength. Ethan hugged her tightly, and she finally smiled, albeit through tears. The battle wasn't over, but in that moment, mother and son had already won something Richard could never regain: the respect and admiration of all. Just as the dust from the initial battles seemed to be settling, a decisive figure approached Mariah and Ethan. Claire Mitchell, Richard's former communications director, approached them with an unexpected proposal. They met in a small community library, away from the cameras, where the silence and the smell of old books offered a safe haven. Claire introduced herself humbly, acknowledging the pain they had both endured. "I worked alongside him for years, and I confess that I often turned a blind eye to things I shouldn't have. But you had the courage to face what I couldn't. I can't erase the past, but I can help build something new." Mariah initially regarded her with suspicion, but the sincerity in Claire's tone and the documents she brought, full of evidence against Richard, showed that this woman wasn't there for vanity, but for justice. It was there that the idea for a social project dedicated to protecting domestic workers and reporting abuse was born. Claire proposed using her communications experience and industry contacts to structure something beyond a momentary protest. Ethan, excited, suggested the project have a hotline for anonymous reporting, just as he had done with the video. "No one should have to choose between silence and humiliation," he said with conviction. Mariah, hesitant, placed her hand on her son's shoulder and murmured, "Maybe that's why all this happened. Maybe it was to give a voice to those who were never heard." Emotion hung in the air, and for a few moments, the three figures, the wounded mother, the courageous son, and the repentant professional, felt united by a mission greater than all the pain they had endured. With the help of lawyers, NGOs, and growing grassroots support, the project took shape within a few weeks. They called it Voices of Dignity, a community organization based in a simple center in the heart of Oklahoma City. There, domestic workers, security guards, gardeners, and so many other invisible people finally found a space to report abuse and receive legal and psychological support. With each new story recorded, Mariah felt her struggle no longer be hers alone, but a collective one. Ethan, always present, helped organize lectures and meetings, transforming her youthful indignation into leadership. Claire, tireless, used her reputation to attract partners and sponsors. What had begun as a tragedy transformed into a movement that no one could silence. And each step taken was another reminder that, even in the face of the arrogance of the powerful, the truth had found a way. As the Voices of Dignity project gained momentum and notoriety, Richard Coleman found himself increasingly isolated in his luxurious mansion, now surrounded not by admirers, but by cameras and accusing gazes. The man who once received invitations to the biggest galas in New York and exclusive parties in Los Angeles now found his calendar empty, his phone silent, and his former allies gone. Friends who used to fawn over him distanced themselves, pretending they had never been by his side, while investors treated him like an unwanted blemish. The mansion, once a symbol of power, had become a gilded prison, where he paced the floors searching for solutions that didn't exist. Bottles of whiskey piled on the table, and the newspapers he so hated now printed his ruin in bold letters. With each new report, the fall became even more cruel. Former employees, previously silenced by fear, gave interviews detailing episodes of humiliation and abuse they had endured for years. Old recordings emerged, reinforcing the image of a man who had always believed that money could buy everything: silence, loyalty, respect. But now, no lawyer could stop the avalanche. On social media, the phrase "the end of the Coleman Empire" became a slogan, shared in thousands of posts celebrating the victory of truth over arrogance. Richard watched it all with growing hatred, but also with a helplessness he had never felt before. For the first time, the man accustomed to giving orders and being obeyed found himself voiceless, swallowed up by the weight of his own choices. As Richard sank, Mariah, Ethan, and Claire were invited to speak at community events and even universities. Stories of ordinary working people echoed alongside Mariah's, and Ethan was celebrated as a symbol of a new generation no longer accepting silence in the face of injustice. The contrast was devastating. On one side, a tycoon increasingly forgotten and ridiculed. On the other, a humble family finding dignity and purpose amidst the chaos. One cold night, Richard turned on the television only to see Mariah being interviewed on a national program. She spoke calmly, without hatred in her voice, but with the firmness of someone who no longer feared anything. "He tried to silence me," she said, "but he couldn't silence the truth." Those words echoed through the emptiness of the mansion, and Richard, alone, understood that his defeat was not just financial. It was personal, irreversible, and definitive. Months later, the community center that hosted Voices of Dignity was packed. Workers from a variety of fields, housekeepers, gardeners, senior caretakers, hotel cleaners, gathered to share stories that had previously been kept silent. Mariah Johnson, once invisible in a millionaire's mansion, was now heard with respect, invited to take the stage and share her story. Beside her, Claire Mitchell efficiently coordinated activities, while Ethan, always restless, helped organize the waiting lines and train young volunteers to guide those arriving. The atmosphere was brimming with hope, with colorful signs that read, "Dignity is not a favor, it is a right." Mariah, moved, held the microphone and said, "We are not here to retaliate with hate. We are here to ensure that no one suffers in silence anymore." Her words drew applause from everyone, filling the room with energy. The press, which had previously hounded Mariah only to exploit the scandal, now followed her to document the growth of a movement that had become a national reference. Documentaries were produced, universities requested lectures, and international NGOs contacted her to replicate the model in other states. Ethan's name appeared in articles like "The Teenager Who Took on an Empire with a Cell Phone," and his face graced the covers of youth magazines as a symbol of courage and integrity. Although shy in the face of so much attention, he accepted invitations to speak to other young people, reinforcing that anyone, no matter how small, can be a voice for change. Mariah watched him with tears in her eyes, remembering the boy who once trembled with fear when holding a cell phone and who now became an inspiration to thousands. As the project flourished, letters of thanks arrived daily. One, sent by a woman from Houston, read, "I've worked as a maid for 20 years and never had the courage to report my boss. After reading your story, I found the strength to leave and rebuild my life. Thank you for giving me back hope." Mariah held the letter close to her chest, feeling that every tear shed, every humiliation she suffered, had now been transformed into purpose. Ethan, at her side, smiled proudly and said, "Mom, this is just the beginning." And in that moment, it became clear to everyone that what had been born from the suffering of a simple family was becoming a flame capable of illuminating lives far beyond their own pain. The late afternoon sun illuminated the simple facade of the Oklahoma City Community Center, reflecting the smiles of dozens of people who came and went with renewed hope. Mariah Johnson walked slowly down the hallway, observing the pictures on the walls with messages of gratitude, photos of volunteers, and stories of transformed lives. With each step, he remembered how it all began. The cold mansion, Richard's screams, the marble floor against which he had collapsed in tears. Now, that past was no longer a burden, but the root of something greater. Beside her, Ethan held a box of flowers to be distributed to visitors. The same boy who once held up a cell phone with trembling hands, but now stood with the firmness of a young leader. The path that seemed impossible had become real, and mother and son were at the center of a quiet revolution. As Mariah was organizing papers, Claire Mitchell entered the room with news. The Voices of Dignity project had received national recognition, with funding approved to expand its activities to other states. Mariah put her hand to her mouth in surprise, tears welling in her eyes. Claire smiled and said, "You've proven that dignity is more powerful than any empire built on fear." Hearing this, Ethan went over to his mother and hugged her tightly, as if making a silent promise to never let her face anything alone. Outside, voices chanted words of gratitude, and volunteers wore t-shirts with a simple phrase that had already become a motto: "The truth sets you free." Mariah took a deep breath, feeling like the fight was just beginning, but for the first time, she no longer felt small in the world. Across town, in a mansion now plunged into silence, Richard Coleman stared blankly at the news. The man who believed he could buy respect was now a shadow of his former self, remembered not for the buildings he built, but for the arrogance that brought him down. Mariah, however, no longer gave him a thought. Her heart was too occupied with the present, with the heartfelt hugs, the stories of courage that emerged every day, and the laughter of her son who could finally dream without fear. On one special night, during a community gathering, Mariah was invited to deliver the final words. She took the microphone, looked around, and said, "We didn't win because we shouted the loudest. We won because we chose the truth, and the truth will always be stronger than silence." Applause echoed through the room, and in that moment, it became clear, from pain, a legacy was born, and that legacy could never be erased. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel now and activate the bell. Like and share this video so more people can be moved and reflect on these messages. Together, we will share stories that inspire, transform, and prove that hope can come through anyone, and teach us that we should never underestimate anyone. Thank you for your support.